Hey guys. Hi everyone, this is Karen Cole from All Chicago. We're going to get started. We have a packed hour today, so we wanted to get started as soon as possible. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. I know there's been a lot of webinars in the last few weeks, and we do appreciate you being on with us. We do have a little bit of housekeeping. We're just going to keep everybody on mute for this call. If you're on the phone, I don't think this will happen, but *6 is another way to mute yourself. If you're having trouble hearing via your computer, you can always call on the phone. Please don't put us on hold, because if somehow you get unmuted, it's a terrible experience for everyone else. We utilize the chat or question box heavily, and I have two amazing people monitoring that, namely Jennifer Fabrini and Elizabeth Perez from our team at All Chicago, to respond to questions and help you with any technical needs. Again, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see a box that says questions/chat, and that's where you should put any questions or comments that you have in there, and they will be sure to respond to you. Again, this is a webinar about the HUD waivers. These were released on March 31st and then announced to the public on April 1st. We're going to have an overview of those and the applicability. We're going to talk about your ability to apply for a waiver and the documentation you need regarding that. So there's a lot of content, so I'm just going to try to go through quickly so we can get to questions, and we will pause from time to time to get your questions in. So these waivers do apply for COC, ESG, HOPWA, and the CON plan. Again, as I just mentioned, these were released on March 31st, 2020, very late in the day. If there's one date you want to remember about these waivers, that is your date, because many of these waivers have time limits that are associated with this day. Of course, these were released by HUD's Community Planning and Development Office. And as I've mentioned a few times already, it applies to COC Emergency Solutions Grants and our Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS or HOPWA grants. The point of these waivers is to help you continue to facilitate services and housing during COVID-19, because we are seeing barriers regarding that already. The other point to note, and I'm sure this will be a point of questions, is in general, this waiver affects participants enrolled or enter into housing after March 31st, 2020. So that's important to note, because I know some of you are probably already working with clients that these waivers could help you with, but if they were already enrolled, for example, then you would not be able to utilize this waiver with them. I'm just going to break down the types really quick. We'll go through the individual waivers on the next few slides, but I want to go through who can apply for the different waivers based on the type. So the COC does have 7 waivers in this notification, and this is something that COC program grantees will notify HUD directly about if they want to apply any of these waivers. So if you're a subrecipient of someone else, if you are a subcontractor, you would not be applying for these. The grantee has to do that for the COC. So for example, if you work with AIDS Foundation Chicago and they sub-grantee to you, I would encourage you to advocate with AIDS Foundation Chicago to apply for these waivers for your particular COC program. Regarding ESG, there are 4 waivers under ESG, and those only can be applied for by the City of Chicago, since they are the recipient of ESG funds for the city. The next one is HOPWA. There are 4 waivers in relation to HOPWA, and these could either be applied for by the City of Chicago. CDPH is the administrator of HOPWA funds for the city, or we do have several competitive grants under HOPWA, and if you are a direct grantee of one of these competitive grants, you can apply directly with HUD for these waivers as well. And lastly, there's 2 waivers regarding the consolidated plan. And again, since the consolidated plan lies with the City of Chicago, they would be the ones applying for those. We're going to go through each of the waivers and what they mean and what their applicability, and then we're going to do a little poll, because as I mentioned, many of these are for the city, and we want to just give the city the support that they need to say apply for these waivers. We anticipate they may do all of them, but just in case. So the first one for the con plan is citizen participation comment period for any amendments. Normally, the city has to give us 30 days notice if they're going to have any amendments and have a public comment period. They're waiving that to 5 days now under this waiver. And the second waiver is that citizen participation is given reasonable notice and opportunity to comment. And so the city has a citizenship participation plan that they're supposed to follow. And this waiver would not have that requirement apply anymore, because as you know, we're with social distancing, we really don't want groups of citizens participating in the communications plan. So I'm just going to pause there and launch a little poll about whether you think the city should be applying for these waivers for themselves and for all of us. So if you agree with one or both of these, please check the box of all of those that you believe the city should apply for or notify HUD on. And we'll close these after just about a minute or so. Again, this is just your opinion. Should the city apply for these waivers regarding the consolidated plan? Okay. So as you can see, the results of the poll are up. And like I said, we're going to just track this, and we're going to let the city know that we've asked you and that this was your thoughts on this. So interesting results for that one regarding participation. The next one I'm going to go into is the ESG one. We feel that these are probably more, sorry, having some challenges with this. The ESG waivers, these more applicable because many of you are subrecipients of the cities or have a contract with them. The first one is regarding HMIS lead activities. Normally, all costs for HMIS would go to the HMIS lead. The waiver would allow the city, for example, to bill for these costs to any recipient could bill for the costs of HMIS. The second one is reevaluations for homeless prevention assistance. So now, those of you who are a homeless prevention agency know we have to reevaluate every 3 months. Under the current regulations, the waiver would allow a reevaluation once every 6 months. So this would give a lot more time, again, because we can't meet with people in person, to do reevaluations. The next one is the housing stability case management. So this is the case management we do see for rapid rehousing primarily. So normally there's a requirement that there's a monthly meeting between the rapid rehousing case manager and participants. So the waiver would allow for case management to be as needed, because we may not be able to physically meet with someone, or people don't have phones, or lots of different reasons. The one little catch for this one is this waiver is only in effect for 2 months after the start of the memo. So I'm not sure why HUD did that, but again, would be helpful for people to not have to meet monthly. And then the last one is the restriction of rental assistance, that rent is at or below FMR, right? We all know that we have to be at or below FMR with our rents, especially for under ESG. The waiver would say that you could rent a unit above FMR, and that would be in effect, I think, at least for 6 months after the date of the memo. But again, these four are all ones that the city would need to apply for. So we're just going to launch another poll and have you weigh in on which of these four, any of the four, all of the four, should the city apply for this waiver. You know, all of these would be very useful, especially the bottom three, for providers or their subgrantees in order to provide services. So if you could weigh in on this one. All right, looks like we're seeing our results right now. Thank you for that, right? Everyone's for the case management. It was exciting, and the reassessments as well as the FMR. So thank you for that. We're going to keep going over to the HUD grant. HUD, HUD has some slight differentiation between the other two programs. Again, this is something the city would apply for since they do receive the majority of HUD funds for the city. But if you are a direct competitive grantee, you could apply for these as well. The first is under HUD. Many of you know we need certification of income and then documentation on HIV status. And so normally we have to have the exact documentation for this, but the waiver would allow self-certification of income and allow you to have credible information about their HIV status. The one thing is that providers would be required to obtain the actual documentation within 3 months of the COVID-19 crisis ending. So that's a great one, right? We know that documentation of HIV and income are very difficult to get right now. The FMR rent standard, again, similar to under ESG, normally we are all required to use FMR, either be at or below it. The waiver allows us to not utilize FMR. We could go above, but it needs to still be reasonable, right? So reasonableness is one of the main things about the FMR. And then the FMR standard would be able to be utilized for up to 1 year after the HUD memo. Regarding property standards for TBRA, as many of you know, we have to meet the housing quality standards before we allow anyone to move into a unit. The waiver would allow you to just visually inspect and re-inspect the unit after the crisis is finished, and this waiver is up for a year after the HUD memo that we received in March. And then finally, space and security. So normally under HUD grants, we need to provide adequate space and security for the participant and their belongings. Sorry, I'm having some technical trouble here. It's telling me I'm not sharing anymore. So we will see that. Sorry, I'm just having some challenges with the technology right now. With under the space and security, this allows for the option for optional space for households affected by COVID-19, right? So if we need to move people because they're in a congregate environment and move them into a hotel or a motel, this allows us to have a waiver for this space and security aspect. We're gonna launch one more poll, and then I might pause for a second before we jump into the COC. So again, we're going to launch the poll about the city. Again, should the city apply for these waivers under the HUD program? All of these, I think, are, in my personal opinion, are very helpful to providers and providing services for people with HIV. We're going to give about a minute. I do see there are some questions, so I'm going to pause after the poll is done. I think we must have a lot of HUD providers on here. We got good feedback. Okay. And so we had some high levels of commitment of wanting the HUD waivers to be applied for by the city. Again, we'll pass this information on to the city that they should apply for these waivers because they will be helpful to their subrecipients. I'm going to pause and just see if we have specific questions we should answer on these three categories of waiver before we move on to the COC, which is really the big one here. So Jennifer or Liz, are there any questions that we should address?
Yeah, Karen. So one is from Avi. Does the HQS waiver include regular inspections for facility-based housing to avoid physical distancing issues?
I think we should, I don't know the answer to that one, Avi. I think we should, we'll reach out to the local HUD office and ask them that question for you. It seems so, but I don't want to say yes and not be for sure, but we'll email the local office and see if they have an answer.
There was a previous question, Karen, around HMIS lead activities waiver. If you could dive a little bit more into that or point them in the right direction for more info.
So, I mean, this is something the city might, this is again, like some of these are a little, we've talked as a team and we're not 100% sure on all of them. So this is like basically how the city expends costs for HMIS activities. And usually you can only pay the HMIS lead, which is all Chicago. And so this would be allow for, if the city wanted to pay someone else for HMIS related activities under COVID-19, they could pay and contract that with someone else. I don't know what that would mean or how that would look, but that as the reg states, that's how it would work. Again, not real sure how helpful or why that is a need. I don't know if it's a need in Chicago. I can anticipate it could be a need someplace else. Anything else?
And then we had Matthew submit a question that basically only applied to all Chicago. So Matthew, if you can send a little bit more background on that. I think, Karen, what you've been sharing is that a lot of the information where the city would be applying for the waiver, we would be giving the information to the city just to share what everyone else is thinking.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay, we have another question that came in. HQS inspections and HOPWA programs would then not need to be done for a year after March 31st. So no need for virtual inspections in the interim.
I mean, I think if you can do a virtual inspection, that sounds like it's HUD's preference, right? But like they're just acknowledging that it may not be, you might not be able to, sorry, I think they're saying do a virtual inspection for and then re-inspect in person after the crisis resolves itself. That's how all of the other ones are too for ESG and COC as well.
Yeah, for HOPWA, it's also helpful. So HUD indicated that there also has to be written policies to physically re-inspect the unit after health officials determine special measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 are no longer necessary. So you want to make sure that's included and you're planning for that.
Okay, I think, any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the COC, which I'm sure will invoke other questions. I want to make sure we get through everything. Okay, so getting to the COC, there's 7 waivers for this, and these are all waivers that a grantee can apply, ask for directly to HUD if they're applicable to their program. So please, we want to make sure that the applicability is there. So the fair market rent for individual units and leasing costs. So units paid with leasing normally cannot exceed FMR. So the waiver is that for transitional and permanent supportive housing leases, the rent can exceed FMR. That this would be in effect for 6 months from the HUD memo. So from the end of March until October, this would be in effect. Disability documentation for PSH. You know, generally what happens is the intake worker observes that someone has a disability, and then you have to document that disability within 45 days for PSH. The waiver would say that the documentation is not required and that the participant can self-certify their disability. So this is, I mean, this is a huge lift of a documentation burden, and this is valid. This waiver would be valid for 6 months from the start of the HUD memo. So the next is the limit on eligible search and counseling services. So under our normal operating, under the supportive services line item, you can bill for eligible costs such as credit counseling, access to your credit report, and resolving credit issues in order to get somebody housed. The waiver would allow you to utilize those supportive services funds to pay for utility and rental arrears when those arrears make it difficult to obtain housing. And this waiver would be in effect from a year from when the memo was issued. And the final one is, again, the same one for ESG regarding rapid rehousing, in that there's a required monthly meeting with the case manager. Again, you will be able to provide case management as needed, but that is really only for 2 months from the date of the HUD memo. So that would really only apply for April and May, the way it reads, unless they decide to extend that waiver past there. The last two are the last three, excuse me, are the first one is housing quality standards. This is the initial physical inspection of the unit. So normally we know we have to physically inspect any unit under leasing or rental assistance before someone can move in. The waiver allows you to use technology and then re-inspect the unit within 3 months of the end of the COVID crisis. And you have to have written policies regarding your method to ensure it will be re-inspected. And then this waiver is in effect for 6 months from when the HUD memo was issued. The next one about HQS is the re-inspection of units. And as we know, for under the COC, we have to annually inspect units to ensure HQS. So if somebody's staying in the same unit for the 2nd or 3rd year, we still have to inspect it every year. And they're going to waive this one for a year from the HUD memo date. So if you apply for this waiver, you won't have to re-inspect units for 12 months. And then the 1-year lease requirement is the last one. So normally we know that for PSH, you have to have a 1-year lease term, and that lease has to be renewable, and it's only terminable for cause, right? There, because of the challenges we are having, as the HUD is waiving the initial lease term, and it just must be at least 1 month, and you are able to apply for that memo utilize that waiver for 6 months after the memo date. So I'm just going to pause for another minute to see if there's any just like general questions about those 7 waivers. Okay.
So Karen, just as a reminder, there was a question about, is this only for new participants who moved in on or after March 31st, 2020? So just remind.
So I think it depends on which waiver you're talking about, right? So like if you're talking about the disability documentation, then that would only apply, and I think I asked this on the HUD office hours on Friday, would only apply for people admitted after March 31st, 2020. But if you're talking about the HQS, I mean, you may not have engaged in a lease agreement because that language is around the lease, or engaged in the housing, in the search or the inspection of the unit. Those are applicable for those who entered before March 31st. So if you're trying to do an HQS next week for someone, like if you apply for the waiver, you should be able to utilize it for that participant. Okay. Okay, I'm going to keep going. So steps for the waiver, so these are the high level steps that we see. I'm going to go through each of them individually in order to ensure that you're doing everything you're supposed to regarding these waivers, regardless of whichever one you may apply for. So first of all, the main thing is to determine which waivers you'll use, right? So this is the link to the notification from HUD. It lists every single waiver, whether it's COC, ESG, or HOPWA. And then we've have some guidance that we have put in the chat. One of the handouts in the chat box says COVID waivers in process. And it's a little quick chart that we created to help you navigate this. So again, read through the waivers, make sure it applies to you, right? Don't apply for the case management one if you don't have rapid rehousing, for example. Maybe today you don't really need to use the waivers because you don't have anyone new moving in, or you don't have anyone where you have to do a renewal HQS inspection. You may not need to apply. So, I mean, that's just things to keep in mind. So the second step is determine when you want to start using them, right? Like I just said, if you don't really have anyone new moving in and you don't have any HQS, you may not need to utilize the waivers today, but you need to apply 2 days before you want to start utilizing any of the waivers. So if you apply, turn it in tomorrow morning, that's Tuesday, you will be able to utilize them on Thursday after you notify HUD. To complete the written notification to send to HUD, if you read that link in the other slide, you'll see that Appendix A gives you all the information that you need in order to apply. You need the requester's name, the declared area where the waiver is going to be used, the date that you anticipate first using it, and the list of waivers that you want flexibility on. So in the handout section, you're going to see that we developed a template for you, so you don't have to take the 10 minutes to create your own template. We put that in the handouts, and you're free to download that to utilize. Oops, I'm just going to show a sample of it right now. I'm just going to see if the magic of technology is going to help me here. Sorry, terrible at sharing. Okay, so here's our sample notification letter. As you can see, I'm just gonna make it a little bigger. Top just says the name of the agency name, the address. Please accept that this is a notification to the HUD field office that we're requesting the available waivers. And you'll be updating your program records to justify that. You'll see we create a little table in here for you. So like first is the submission date. So if you're doing it today, put in today's date, the date you anticipate utilizing it, 2 calendar days later, the requester's name, title, and email, then your the name of your agency, and then HUD wants you to list all of the projects and grant numbers that you want to utilize this waiver for, right? So if you have 7 PSH projects and you think you're going to need it for all 7, list them all. If you are one of our partners that works in multiple COCs, you can utilize this waiver for any jurisdiction that you're in. So if you're in Suburban Cook or if you're in McHenry, you can just submit one waiver for all of them. I know it says COC, but you should include HOPWA grants if you're one of the HOPWA competitive grantees as well. And then the declared disaster area area that you're going to be using it, like we put this in here, and this is what everyone should use. City of Chicago, Cook County. If you need to add other counties, you should do that. And then we just put a table in here that you can just like check or write or type in yes for any of the waivers that you want to use, right? So in the sample, we just listed the ones that seemed, important for permanent supportive housing providers, for example. But we listed all the COC and all the HOPWA ones that may be applicable to you. Sign it, and then you can just send it off. So I'm going to switch back to the slideshow. Okay, so that was our sample. And then once you've written your sample, you've written your notification, you need to send it to the HUD office. So HUD has created specialized email addresses for everyone to apply with. And so this is our address right here. We can also put it in the question or the chat box. We haven't seen any notification of like CCing the director at the local office or your CPD rep. So I would just utilize this address, and that's the only one. And then there's the implementation of the waiver, right? And your justification for using them. So you can start using the waiver, like we said, within 2 calendar days of notifying HUD. And then you need to update your program records to include the documentation, the special conditions that justify you using the waiver, and then that's consistent with the applicability and provisions, right? This is the language from HUD, and it's like, whoa, what does that mean? So basically, you just have to document why you're applying this waiver and how you're going to do it. So some of you were on our call on Thursday when we talked about interim record keeping protocols. So over the weekend, it all lined up, right? Like we could use the protocol that we talked about last week in order to show the justification. So what I did is I put a little sample together of the record keeping protocol that we talked about last time. So this is our sample, right? This is in accordance with the record keeping standard operating procedures, right? So the first part of it, of this template we gave you last week, was describe the emergency situation. So, I just jotted in here some things. The national, state, and city government has declared a high health crisis due to COVID-19. We had a federal disaster area. You could add a line that says our CEO, declared that it was on this date. So then you have your authorizing official sign and date it, right? And then it says describe the record keeping policies impacted by the emergency situation, right? So in this case, the really awesome housing agency is implementing the HUD waiver regarding initial housing quality standards, right? So this is the language of this, COVID-19 waiver is below, right? So then it says description of best efforts to use to maintain records. So this is where I put the justification and applicability piece from the HUD language. So, right, so the waiver of this requirement is that the recipient physically inspect each unit to meet HQS before providing assistance, and it's in effect for 6 months. So, and that we are meeting the following criteria. The recipient is able to visually inspect the unit using technology to ensure the unit meets HQS before assistance is provided. And then the recipient or subrecipient has written policies to physically inspect the unit later, right? Let's laying out all the reasons you're doing this. And then below is the language from our written policy to physically re-inspect the unit. So this is kind of the protocol that an agency could put in place to ensure that you're tracking and will eventually inspect every single unit later, right? And we did put this in the handout section so you can see this sample. So basically this lays out all of your justification, why you have this waiver, what it says, and then when it ends, you sign it. So I would say like you should have some sort of template or letter or document like this, and then this is what you put in the client's file now, and then I would attach this, if it's HQS, to the actual inspection when you do it after the COVID-19 crisis ends. Sorry, my computer keeps wanting to do things I don't want it to. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, I'm having a little personal technical challenge right now. Okay, so that's your sample. So so you need to have records of why you're using the waiver and what you're doing. And then 6 is, eventually this health crisis will end. The health department will notify us when it does. And then for some things we have to actually go back and obtain the documentation for the waivers that's required. So example, for HQS, like we have to go back and physically inspect the units later. For income and HIV status for HUD, we actually have to get that documentation at a later date. So those are your 6 steps. And now I'm going to pause because now we have time. Hopefully, we have a lot of time for questions, actually. And I'm going to breathe for a second. So Liz and Jennifer, any more questions?
Yeah, so we have one. Is the emergency record keeping protocol, is the record keeping protocol just to justify the waivers or to be used for other general record keeping requirements separate from the waiver? For instance, income documentation.
Yeah, I think it's for both, right? So I think with that template, you need to be clear about what specific things that template is covering. So you can definitely use it for the waiver like I did in this webinar, but you can also use it for income verification because we know that the Social Security office is now closed, right? So that would just, the language would just look different to say, we're having this emergency because of COVID-19. We want to utilize this template and protocol for documentation of income. You know, I would put in there the date that the Social Security office closed if that's your source of income verification. And then in the steps, you want to put the steps that you engaged in to try to achieve that documentation. So I think it can be used for both. You'll just have to change up the language a little bit.
Another question is, any potential consequences for using the waiver? For instance, if we are unable to get documentation even after time has passed.
What documentation are you trying to get? So with disability documentation, you do not have to go back and get disability documentation if you use the COC disability waiver. So if you have the person self-certify, that will be sufficient to keep in their file for all time. So that's what people have asked that to HUD last 2 weeks over and over, or last week over and over. Do you need to go back and get disability documentation? And the answer is no. I didn't see other, I mean, I think, you know, HQS, you just have to physically inspect it. I mean, with HOPWA, if you're concerned about getting the HIV documentation, but I don't think there's a time standard on that. It's 3 months. So hopefully within 3 months you can get that.
For the disability documentation waiver for COC programs, does the disability have to be observed?
Well, I mean, that's just the standard that we always have, right? I mean, the process really is like you have the intake and hopefully that intake worker is observing the disability in some way, or you're hearing about it. But then you just can utilize, but now you can just utilize self-certification. I mean, I think HUD is kind of saying, this is again Karen's opinion, it's a crisis, right? Let's trust that people are being honest and forthcoming about their disabilities and their disabling conditions. I mean, I think, I don't know how to answer that otherwise. If you don't think they're really disabled, then don't admit them, right? I mean,
All right, a lot of people have asked if this PowerPoint presentation is going to be available after the webinar, and yes, we will be posting it to the Slack channel. So for those of you that are wondering if you can get a copy, and also all the handouts are included in the chat box, but we'll be posting those as well for later reference.
Yeah, wherever we post it, we'll announce it to people. It may also be in the online learning portal too.
We also got a question a little bit further back. If you decide to submit a waiver with a set of items to be waived, can you at a later date ask for a second waiver later, adding something not checked in the first?
Yeah, I think you would just submit a second waiver with just the things that you are doing the second round. Like, you don't have to do all of them this week or today. I mean, I think if you know, like if you need, one or two of them now and then later, because maybe maybe you need just the, re-inspection one right now because you don't have any new people, but then in 2 weeks someone leaves and you have to house somebody new, then you could submit another one for those other things. You don't have to do them all in one shot. There appears to be no deadline of applying for them, so that we've heard, right, Liz?
That's right. All right, we have another one. Does the waiver apply to LTRA? When tenants owe past due rent to the landlords and the tenant needs to move, the agency can use rental assistance funds to pay the past due rent.
So it appears that is true. So if someone is at risk of losing their housing and you're trying to move them, and because of COVID-19, you can't find another unit, for example. So in order to help them stay in their current unit, you could pay the arrears. I think you just have to be real careful about documenting like your attempts to find another unit and that you couldn't find another unit, or that the new unit you found, the person wouldn't rent to the client because they had arrears from the old unit. I mean, this is, again, my personal opinion, that's the one that's a little hazy for me about the documentation and the situation where that would arise. But that seems to be the situation that I envision, is that, there's a risk of someone losing their housing because they're behind on their portion of their rent, right? And so you want to move them. Maybe you're trying to find a new unit, but you can't. So you negotiate with the landlord to pay the back rent, but you got to document all that stuff, right? You have to document all your attempts to find another place and that you couldn't get one and this was the only option, stuff like that.
So those are all the questions that have come through, Karen, unless people are frantically typing to get some questions to you.
Okay, let's give people a couple more minutes, or if they want to put them in the chat. I mean, if anyone wants to really talk, we could maybe unmute someone. I don't know if we want to do that, but we could. Okay, I feel like I keep seeing the chat box go, but. The question box. Okay, it looks like we have no new questions. So if that's the case, then I am going to end the webinar. Thank you all for attending. If you have other questions, please don't hesitate to.
I couldn't quite hear you.
Jesus, sorry. Siri thought I was talking to her. If you have other questions, don't hesitate to email CSU programs. We're happy to talk through some of them. We'll definitely pass on the questions that we haven't been able to answer, specifically the one about HOPWA and facility-based inspections, to the local office and see what they say and get back to Chicago House on that. But anything else that comes up in the interim, feel free to reach out to us. And we appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to come on this webinar. Thank you.